For many Americans, taxes are the price we pay for a civilized society, but in the mid-19th century, it was different. In fact, most Americans didn't pay any direct taxes at all. There was no income tax, no Social Security tax. His first two terms we can basically think of as a continuation of John Quincy Adams's first term, which was dominated by the Nullification Crisis and the rise of states' rights. For Jackson, maintaining national unity was the priority. And so when it came time to reauthorize the tariff in 1832, he pushed for the Compromise Tariff Bill, which lowered rates from the previous year, but not as low as Southern Democrats wanted. South Carolina didn't like this, and after the state legislature declared the tariff null and void within its borders, Jackson threatened to use force to collect duties. Now, some Southern leaders, like John C. Calhoun, wanted to use that leverage to push for nullification. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty had lowered rates to British levels, but American manufacturers still weren't satisfied. While Northern Democrats were willing to accept a moderate increase in tariffs, Southern Democrats wanted to keep things as low as possible. With cheaper European goods flooding their markets, mills and factories shut down. Unemployment rose and people took to the streets in protest. He sent troops to protect the mills of New England, a move that won him the nickname Old Kinderhook. And when a group of South Carolinians attempted to secede in 1832, everyone else was glad to be done with it. But the threat remained. And now that violence was in the open, the stakes were higher than ever. What happens next will shock you. But it also put him at odds with Southern Democrats who claimed that he was violating the Constitution. Our founding fathers warned us about stuff like this. They knew that political parties would become breeding grounds for corruption and cronyism. So in Federalist 10, Madison famously wrote that if you create a government based on a broad representation, then factions arising from the most opposite elements can keep an eye on each other, so that none become too powerful. And we can see that principle in action today with our own two eyes. Because right now, there's this company called Public. They run a website that brings together public records about politicians and connects them to news stories and social media posts, so you can better understand who they are, what they're about, and whether or not you can trust them. Like you can search every member of Congress and see their voting record, how much money they've raised, and whether or not they've ever committed any ethical violations. Or you can follow individual issues like gun control or abortion rights and see how your member of Congress voted on them. It's super valuable stuff, especially when everything is so partisan. And it's all free. That's right, Public is completely free. Because the founders envisioned a government that was of the people, by the people, and for the people. Of course, violence wasn't far behind. The Liberty and anti-Masonic parties both nominated anti-tariff candidates, and the campaign was vicious. At one rally, a crowd shouted "Old Hickory," until former President Andrew Jackson came out to greet them. Another man climbed onto a chair and screamed, "Who's next? Who's next?" Not one to disappoint. Jackson pointed his cane toward the White House and shouted, "Van Buren." By January, a mob had gathered outside the Astor House in New York, where they planned to meet with President Van Buren and demand that he take action. But Van Buren refused to come out. When the mob started to disperse, one of the protesters, a tailor named Alexander Hamilton, took off his coat and cried, "By the blood of my ancestors, I will be the death of you and your administration." Van Buren backed away and Hamilton shot him. Though the bullet ricocheted off the president's watch chain, the assassination attempt proved that the tariff crisis was starting to get personal. Then came the compromise, an agreement to kill a proposed 25% tariff on wool and replace it with a 12.5% tariff on all manufactured goods. The South loved it. It was exactly what they wanted. The North hated it. Representative John A. Davis of Massachusetts called it a surrender to the South. But the younger generation of fire-eating Southern Democrats were in no mood for compromise. For them, the idea that they were supposed to play nice with the North was a relic of the past. Take South Carolina Senator Robert Hayne, who, after delivering an impassioned defense of slavery in the Senate in 1830, was asked by an acquaintance why he bothered. Didn't he know that the South would never win? Because Hayne replied, "I want to plant the firebrands." In the end, it was South Carolina alone that backed down. But the larger point was clear. No matter how popular tariffs were, they weren't worth destroying the Union over. The admission of Wisconsin and Iowa meant that the South's voting bloc had shrunk to 9 states. So if Louisiana was admitted with slavery, the Senate would probably vote it down. As a result, some Southern leaders continued to push for nullification. Others tried to convince their colleagues to vote against the compromise tariff. Like Mississippi Senator Henry's Foote, he suggested that they refuse to participate in the congressional vote until a compromise could be reached. But Southern Democrats were tired of compromise. The very idea of nullifying federal law still hadn't caught on outside of South Carolina. And now they were being asked to sacrifice even more. Plus, they had leverage. With the threat of blocking Louisiana's admission, they forced Northern Democrats to give in. The compromise tariff passed by a single vote in the Senate, thanks to the support of 6 Southern Democrats. The only way the government raised money was through tariffs on imports. But that ended up creating a financial panic in 1837 that threw the economy into recession. Though he might have had little control over it, voters blamed Jackson anyway and turned against his party in the election of 1840. In the end, the Whig victory ushered in a new era in American politics with the collapse of the second-party system. That is, whenever something was brought into the United States from another country, it had to pay a duty. It meant that tariffs would continue to be low during Martin Van Buren's presidency. And when the debate came up again in 1842, it exploded into an even bigger sectional crisis than before. To see what happened, let's go to the how much it cost depended on what it was. If it was manufactured in Europe, it would be more expensive than if it were raw materials from the Americas. Texas, which had won its independence from Mexico in 1836, was a shoo-in. For the rest, well, it depended on how much trouble they were willing to cause. In the case of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Iowa, the answer was none. Their constitutions were quickly approved, and they were admitted to the Union in 1848. The same could not be said of the proposed state of Louisiana. Its constitution included slavery. That provision did not sit well with Northern Whigs and Democrats, and they were prepared to fight to keep Louisiana out of the Union unless the issue of slavery was resolved first. Even worse for Southern interests, these 3 new states were unlikely to vote for a pro-slavery constitution. Whatever happened, it seemed clear that admitting Louisiana would upset the balance of power in the Senate. The purpose of this was to protect local industry by making foreign products less competitive on American shelves. It also made raising money easy. Just raise the rates. In fact, tariffs were so popular that the U.S. government used them not just to raise money, but to raise hell. We know this because the whole system was a political lightning rod. Whenever Congress passed a tariff, there was a battle between pro-tariff Northern Democrats and anti-tariff Southern Democrats. Most of the latter were slaveholders who knew that higher tariffs meant higher prices for manufactured goods that they bought but could unsell. And while those things required manufactured tools, like the plows and textiles, they couldn't turn a profit selling them. After all, a tractor doesn't grow on trees. So the South imported most of what they needed. Northerners, meanwhile, did most of the manufacturing themselves and preferred keeping most of the profits in their own hands. And that's why Northerners favored high tariffs. On top of that, they were anxious about the competition from European manufacturers, who, they believed, would steal American jobs and undermine American industry. Southerners, meanwhile, saw tariffs as an effort to screw over Western farmers, who often relied on manufactured goods from back east. Plus, since Southerners were mostly yeoman farmers themselves, they argued that tariffs hurt rural people like them, especially since most tariffs disproportionately affected food staples. A high tariff wall, said South Carolina Representative James L. Orr in 1824, would raise a virtual prohibition on the importation of many articles which our people must have and cannot make. This debate over tariffs was going strong when Andrew Jackson came to office in 1829, though he wasn't really interested in either. That being the case, Jackson might have hoped that his second term would be remembered for something else entirely, like his war on the Bank of America. But even though the Whigs controlled the White House and the House of Representatives, they couldn't do much about the Senate, where Southern Democrats still held the majority. In the 1830s, several states along the American frontier had been clamoring for statehood. It was an explosive situation that gave Southern leaders leverage like they hadn't had in years. And the following year, they had a chance to start a fire when the debate over tariffs came up again. Of course, the situation was even trickier because the proposed Louisiana Constitution still had to be settled. The results were immediate. New England and the Middle Atlantic states experienced a sharp decline in manufacturing. With that, Van Buren finally decided to take action. Now, after 4 years of fighting over tariffs, everyone was exhausted. Okay, let us talk about tariffs because it turns out that Americans have been taxing the hell out of stuff since before it was cool. So, in this video, we consider the origins of American tariff policy between the years 1789 and 1816. And if you were hoping for a nice little neat narrative that explains how we got to where we are now, well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but history doesn't really work like that. What I can do is show you the major events that have shaped our economic history and explain why they happened. These duties ranged from 5% to 15% and applied to things like textiles, glass, and iron. See, here's the thing. Tariffs have traditionally served two purposes: raising money for the government and protecting domestic industries. And these two functions sort of conflict with each other. Ideally, you want to tax imports as much as possible to protect domestic industries. But you don't want to tax them so much that people stop buying imported goods altogether. This was enough of a departure from the previous revenue-based tariffs that it earned the nickname protectionist bill. And there are several reasons why this was a significant shift in American policy. First of all, it marked a clear break from the policies of the era of good feelings. Listen, I'm not trying to paint the Northern industrialists as some kind of cartoonish villains, but they also understood the power of manipulating public policy for their own benefit. And that's something that politicians do all the time, even today. Do you remember how the era of good feelings was characterized by intense nationalism and a desire to promote American manufacturing? As a result, Britain and the United States quickly became economic rivals in manufactured goods. And when that happened, Britain retaliated by imposing their own tariffs on American agricultural products. So now you have this situation where the U.S. is taxing British agricultural products and Britain is taxing American agricultural products. And do you know what economists call that? A trade war. And yes, it's something that we are also familiar with today. Yeah, well, the Tariff of 1816 represented a kind of backlash against that. And this is when the infamous Tariff of Abominations was passed, which raised tariffs to even higher levels. Southerners felt that they had good reason to oppose tariffs. And they were joined by Westerners who simply did unlike being told what to do by snobby Eastern industrialists. Now, this was the beginning of the end for the first-party system. It was becoming increasingly clear that the differences between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists ran deeper than their personal feelings toward Alexander Hamilton. The rise of new economic interests in the United States was creating new political divisions, which would eventually erupt in the election of 1828. And you're probably wondering, okay, how did the United States get from the relatively moderate tariff of 1789 to the extreme Tariff of Abominations? And my answer to that is gradualism. You don't go from 5 to 25 in one generation. It's a process that happens over decades. And again, that's something that we recognize even today. After decades of trying to build up American manufacturing, It turned out that American manufacturers wanted the government to protect them from foreign competition. And that was weird for Americans to think about. The idea that America was too weak to compete with European powers in trade seemed to go against the whole grain of American exceptionalism. If that happens, then your tariff isn't raising any money. The American system was fiercely opposed by President James Monroe, who vetoed an earlier version of the bill. And his argument against it was basically the entire foundation of classical free trade. Here's what Monroe said: "If we could add nothing to the mass of the world's goods, if we could neither import nor export, we would certainly be worse off. The whole system of foreign exchanges would be deranged. All the products of the earth, agriculture, mining, manufacturing, would become proportionally more scarce and more expensive. It should be our policy to take as little from our citizens as will leave them as well off as they would be under a free and uncontrolled importation of all the goods of the world." But unfortunately, I don't have an answer. As far as I can tell, they just picked those things. But there's a reason why most countries don't run their economies that way. And it has to do with the fact that humans are greedy little bastards. When unchecked, this greed can lead to monopolies and bad working conditions and all kinds of other social ills. So governments often feel compelled to step in and regulate the free market to prevent these things from happening. And that's why the opposition to the Tariff of 1816 came mostly from Southerners and Westerners. Southerners were fine with high tariffs on manufactured goods, because that protected Northern industries from competing with Southern agriculture. But Westerners hated it because they relied on selling their crops in distant Eastern markets, which meant that they were consumers of manufactured goods. Plus, the agricultural products that Westerners sold were often inputs for Eastern manufacturers, meaning that if you taxed those agricultural products, you were essentially taxing the very materials that these manufacturers used to make their stuff. But during the era of good feelings, the focus was overwhelmingly on protection. Now, listen, I do want to make light of the fact that America actually did go to war not long after this. But it's hard not to notice that every single time a group of Americans start talking about how they need to protect American jobs and industries, they always conveniently ignore the fact that, the United States has like 190-some-odd thousand-year history of going to war. I'm just saying. Remember, the era of good feelings occurred during a period of intense nationalism, when Americans felt particularly warm and fuzzy about the United States. And one way this manifested itself was in an obsession with American manufacturing. I mean, Americans didn't dislike free trade in theory. It's just that they thought that America was too young and weak to participate in it, because they were manufactured goods that could be produced domestically. That, and they needed money. So first up, let's talk about the Tariff of 1789. Back in the olden times when George Washington was president? And after the war ended, they flooded the country with cheap goods, which undercut American manufacturers. So now you have a bunch of American businessmen who are understandably pissed off about this, and several members of Congress who are eager to protect American jobs. So what happens? They use tariffs. Well, he had a lot on his plate, trying to get the new federal government off the ground, and one of his tasks was figuring out how to pay for it. Now, at the time, the only way to raise money was through taxes, and there were many options for how to do that. You could tax land, but that would discourage people from buying land, which was not great for a country that was rapidly growing westward. You could tax people directly with a sales tax or an income tax, but that would be a little too, socialist. So instead, the framers decided to turn to the one true capitalist method of taxation, taxing trade. In 1789, Congress passed a Tariff Act, which established import duties on a variety of goods coming into the United States. Now, once all the numbers were crunched, it turned out that the tariff was projected to raise around $1.4 million per year, which is equivalent to about $5 billion today. And that sounds like a lot, but it wasn't. It turned out that the actual cost of running the federal government was much higher than anyone had anticipated. And even after the tariff was doubled in 1794, it still wasn't enough. In fact, the U.S. government was consistently running a deficit during this period. So we can say that the Tariff of 1789 and 1794 were mainly revenue measures. Their purpose was to help pay for the new federal government. But these tariffs also protected fledgling American industries by making foreign competitors more expensive. So historically, tariffs have been adjusted based on a complicated calculus that takes both revenue and protection into account. During this period, several bills were introduced in Congress to protect American industries from foreign competition, including one by Representative James Findley of Pennsylvania, who argued that the government had a responsibility to foster manufacturing in order to keep the country strong in case of future wars. Anyway, the War of 1812 was fought primarily against the British, who, you guessed it, had a ton of stuff to sell in the American market. In 1816, Congress passes the Tariff of 1816, also known as the American System, which significantly increased tariffs on raw materials and manufactured goods. But the other thing that made the Tariff of 1816 so interesting was the opposition it generated. And that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Free stuff, no taxes. Sounds great. Now, this regional divide wasn't a coincidence. It was the result of a deliberate political strategy on the part of Northern industrialists. This is a great moment to point out that the Industrial Revolution began in England, but it soon spread to other places, including the northeastern United States. Anyway, by 1828, things had gotten so bad that a new tariff was needed. The opposition to the Tariff of Abominations was even more intense. Now, all these things were supposed to work together in order to make the United States more industrialized and therefore more powerful, both economically and militarily. Also, as we saw in the last video, the American system was backed by three big wigs: John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and James Monroe. And those three guys were all moderates, which made it easier for them to work together and get things done, because they weren't beholden to any particular region or interest group. Oh sure, they had to share power with the Federalists in the Senate. But in the House, the Democratic Republicans had a 2/3 supermajority, which meant that they could pass any legislation they wanted over the opposition of the Federalists. And that brings us to the first major piece of legislation that they passed, which was the Protective Tariff of 1816. Because once you get back, we talk about the first major piece of legislation ever passed, which was designed to implement the American system. Why? Well, the answer is simple. Southerners bought manufactured goods from the North, and now those goods were more expensive. Despite its many successes, it sowed the seeds of sectional dispute between the industrializing North and the agrarian South. In fact, the very policies that the United States used to become industrialized helped to set the stage for the Civil War. From that point forward, sectional disputes overshadowed any hope for compromise, and the country began to split along geographic lines. Even though Congress didn't have the money to fund roads and canals, individual states did. So state-sponsored internal improvements continued throughout the 1830s and 40s. It was backed by John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and James Monroe. And additionally, right over here is the video on the Missouri Compromise. And it was made possible by the overwhelming power of the Democratic Republicans following the War of 1812. The first major piece of legislation to implement the American system was the Protective Tariff of 1816. This was the first protective tariff in American history, and it imposed 20 to 25% duties on imported goods. The tariff was designed to protect specific industries in specific regions. For example, northern states wanted to protect their textile factories, and western states wanted to protect their iron industry. And for the most part, the plan worked. Northern manufacturing boomed after the implementation of the tariff. But the South grew wary of tariffs because they were forced to pay higher prices for manufactured goods. And that led to growing sectional animosity between the North and the South. The protective tariffs of the American system are considered one of the major causes of the Civil War. However, one aspect of the American system that outlived the rest was internal improvements. Even though Congress didn't have the money to fund roads and canals, individual states did. So state-sponsored internal improvements continued throughout the 1830s and 40s, and the most famous of these projects was the Erie Canal, which connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. And the most famous of these projects was the Erie Canal, which connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. And that's probably a good place for us to stop. By the end of the 1840s, two distinct political parties had formed, the Democrats of the South and the Whigs of the North. And both of those parties opposed the continuation of the American system. Here is a map showing protective tariffs from 1816 to 1860. And you can see that after the Tariff of 1816, each subsequent tariff protected northern industries at the expense of southern planters. And that led to growing sectional animosity between the two regions. But if you want a deeper answer, then let me give you one. But the system also failed because it ultimately contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War. In fact, the protective tariffs of the American system are considered one of the major causes of the war. And that is because the South eventually seceded rather than submit to tariffs that they felt were imposed to benefit the industrial interests of the North. And to be fair, they were right on the money. See, the southern states had very little industry. Really, their only industry was slavery. And that was not something that they wanted to change. They were perfectly happy exporting their agricultural products to the industrializing North and importing their manufactured goods. And what's more, the wealthy planters of the South were the ones who benefited the most from this arrangement. In other words, the Tariff of 1816 was a boon to northern manufacturers and a bane to southern planters. In other words, he wanted to build up industry throughout the entire United States. But the authors of the Tariff of 1816 were more concerned with protecting specific industries in their own regions. For example, northern states wanted to protect their textile factories from foreign competition. The South responded by organizing a political party called the Democratic Party, which advocated nullification and states' rights. And that brings us to a major turning point in the development of the United States. Meanwhile, Western states wanted to protect their burgeoning iron industry. So this was the first protective tariff in American history. You see, in the election of 1812, James Madison defeated his opponent, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, by a landslide. On average, the Tariff of 1816 imposed 20 to 25% duties on imported goods. And those goods that were most protected were textiles and iron. And here's a chart showing how the Tariff of 1816 compared to previous tariffs. And you can see that this was a pretty radical departure from previous policies of the United States. In fact, the Democratic Republicans won 2/3 of the seats in both houses of Congress, making them arguably the most powerful party in the history of the United States. But by 1816, they had become full-fledged protectionists. And you can see the results of that right here. In this graph, you can see the dramatic increase in manufacturing in the United States after the imposition of the Tariff of 1816. And that is because it protected new industries from foreign competition and gave them a chance to grow. For example, before 1816, Britain had dumped so many textiles on the American market that domestic textile manufacturers could uneven turn a profit. But after the Tariff of 1816, American textile manufacturers thrived. Well, the answer is simple. They were riding a wave of public support that resulted from the War of 1812. That would be the Tariff of 1816, and you won't want to miss it. Okay, so to review real quick, the American system was an economic plan to strengthen the nation through protective tariffs, a national bank, and internal improvements. But the one thing that made passing the American system possible was the overwhelming political power of the Democratic Republicans. Now, at the time, most Americans didn't think the war was worth fighting. But after the conflict ended in 1815, it became clear that American interests had been secured. Canada was not going to be annexed, and the British were not going to invade again anytime soon. Then came the Hartford Convention. I mean, really, what better way to bolster your political fortunes than to have your opponents meet in secret and openly talk about secession? In reality, the Hartford Convention was a group of New England Federalists who met to discuss grievances against the federal government, mostly concerning trade restrictions imposed during the war. But to most Americans, it just looked like a bunch of unpatriotic malcontents looking to break up the Union. As a result, when the delegates left for home, they received a hero's welcome. I mean, of course, by hero's welcome, I mean their political careers were absolutely decimated. And that brings us to the present day, where the Democratic Republicans were riding high on a wave of popularity and eager to pass legislation that would continue to cement their power. And that's why the election of 1812 was such a big deal, because it allowed the Democratic Republicans to essentially run the country without interference for the next 12 years. Now you might remember from Unit 3 that Alexander Hamilton also pushed for protective tariffs. But his argument was based on economic policy, not sectional interest. And despite the fact that the American system succeeded in many ways, it also sowed the seeds of discontent between the North and the South. Now, you might recall that the Democratic Republicans had spent much of their early years opposing tariffs and even repealed the whiskey tax imposed by the Federalists. But while the North was generally happy with the tariff, the South was not. And that brings us to the legacy of the American system. In the end, the American system accomplished some of its goals, namely a strong national bank, a protective tariff, and improved transportation systems. For example, in 1828, Congress passed the Tariff of Abominations, which further protected Northern industries and raised the ante in the sectional dispute. You see, in 1832, President Andrew Jackson vetoed a bill to renew the Bank of the United States, and that marked the beginning of the end for the American system. However, there was one aspect of the American system that outlived the rest, namely internal improvements. So let's review real quick. The American system was an economic plan to strengthen the nation through protective tariffs, a national bank, and internal improvements. Okay, so to understand the Nullification Crisis, you have to first know about the Tariff of Abominations. Now officially, it was called the Tariff of 1828, and for the most part, it did exactly what tariffs usually do. It protected Northern manufactured goods from foreign competition by making it more expensive to buy manufactured goods from abroad. But unlike most tariffs, this one was really nasty. I mean, really ugly. You know, like a woman scorned kind of nasty. And we'll see why in a minute. But first, a quick review. Remember that during the first 2 decades after the War of 1812, the United States had been in an economic panic because the nation's supply of specie or hard currency, mostly silver and gold, was severely depleted. The only bright spot, economically speaking, was manufacturing, and that was doing okay thanks to protective tariffs like the one we looked at in the last video. But to put it mildly, most Americans were having a rough time of it. Farmers especially were going through the proverbial hell, because they were still saddled with high taxes on their land, even though the tax base had dropped precipitously. So when Andrew Jackson came along and started talking about destroying the national bank and doing away with taxes, well, he sounded pretty good to a lot of folks. And then when the election of 1824 threw the election into the House of Representatives and Henry Clay used his influence to throw the election to John Quincy Adams, well, a lot of folks thought that the bank and the wealthy elite had stolen the election from Jackson. So you can see that when the South Carolina legislature sent John C. Calhoun to the Senate in 1825, it wasn't much of a stretch for him to be a vocal opponent of the bank and high tariffs which hurt his constituents, the farmers and planters of South Carolina. Now in this video, we've talked about how Calhoun once supported tariffs when they benefited the South, but now he was vehemently opposed to them, which is another reason why people call him Mr. Contradiction, because he flip-flopped so badly. But anyway, when the new tariff passed in 1828 that raised duties on imported goods to as high as 45 to 50%, Southerners like Calhoun were not happy. The president and many members of Congress from the North designed this tariff specifically to pander to Southern voters. Why? Well, because they thought the tariff issue would be enough to get Andrew Jackson re-elected in 1828. Calhoun wrote the document known as the Exposed South Carolina Exposition and Protest. In it, he stated, "The power, therefore, to tax is an inherent power of the state. It is an attribute of sovereignty." While both Calhoun and Haynes agreed that the tariff should be nullified, Haynes said that the document went too far. It was too radical. Members of Congress from all over the country began debating whether or not South Carolina had the right to nullify federal law. And it seemed to many that the nation was on the verge of dissolving itself in a chaotic cloud of interposition and nullification. Calhoun had suggested that South Carolina should secede from the Union if the tariff wasn't repealed, which was a bit much for Haynes and the more conservative members of the delegation. So they sent a less radical version of the document to Congress, but the damage was done. The state has taxed, and the power has never been disputed until now. The federal government has no right to impose taxes on the state without its consent. In other words, the federal government could untell the state of South Carolina what it could or could not tax, and if it tried to do so, South Carolina could simply nullify that law. And in their minds, it was worth alienating the South in order to get themselves reelected. Unfortunately for them, they were wrong. Calhoun had spent years arguing against nullification, but now that it would help him look like a champion of the common man, he suddenly became a staunch defender of the doctrine. And don't forget that he did it secretly. He didn't want anyone to know that he was the author of the document, even though he had written it in his own handwriting. Because nullification was such a radical idea that if anyone knew he had written it, it probably wouldn't elect him to anything ever again. So that's why he used a pseudonym, just in case. This tariff is commonly known as the Tariff of Abominations, not because it was particularly bad for the entire country, but because it was particularly bad for the South. See, while it is true that the nation as a whole benefited from this tariff, because it protected northern industries from foreign competition, the South was actually worse off because it paid higher prices for manufactured goods. Furthermore, since the South didn't engage in much manufacturing, no one in the South really benefited from the protective tariffs. On the one hand, you had guys like John C. Calhoun, who wanted to use nullification to strike down the tariff. But on the other hand, you had guys like Robert Y. Hayne, who argued that nullification couldn't be selectively used that way. It had to be used in defense of all things Southern. So the North's little plan backfired, because they pissed off the South even more than they had been before. They just paid higher prices for everything. So naturally, the South hated the tariff, and they weren't the only ones. The interesting thing about this tariff is that it was designed by Northern Jacksonians to win votes. That's right. Here's the thing. By this point, the South Carolina delegation to Congress had already split into two factions over the issue of nullification. So in response to the new tariff, the South Carolina legislature hired John C. Calhoun to write a document for them to send to Congress, arguing that South Carolina could nullify the tariff within its borders. Now here's the irony. However, the South Carolina delegation split once again over this document. The very mention of secession caused a political earthquake that reverberated all the way to Washington, D.C. Now, in this video, we've look at what is generally considered to be the first crisis of the young United States. First of all, that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had temporarily diffused the slavery issue by admitting Missouri as a slave state, and Maine as a free state, and then establishing a line across the Louisiana Purchase where slavery would be prohibited north of that line except for Missouri. The South did not like tariffs because they were forced to pay more for manufactured goods, while the North benefited from the protection they provided. You see, tariffs were taxes on imported goods, and thus the South was taxed, but the North was protected from foreign competition. Well then, along comes Henry Clay, who is running for re-election to the Senate and is very popular in the South. And he proposes what's called the Compromise Tariff of 1833. And it goes like this. The new tariff will gradually reduce the rates over 10 years until they almost back to what they were before the Tariff of Abominations. First of all, let's talk about why this was a significant event. Well, first of all, the dispute was over an economic policy, not over the issue of slavery, which would cause the Civil War 2 decades later. Until next time, I'm out. While the nullification controversy would become a major issue in the lead-up to the Civil War, it was not yet fully engaged in this conflict. Secondly, the South had never really intended to secede during this crisis. While South Carolina had passed ordinances of secession, no Southern state had ever seceded over this issue. In fact, no state would ever secede over any issue other than slavery. And thirdly, both sides had too much invested in preserving the Union, while the South had soured on the federal government. It had also grown accustomed to many of the benefits it received from the federal government. Plus, many of the Southern states had joined the Union voluntarily, and they had no intention of undoing that decision. In the end, the nullification crisis was compromised, but it left a legacy of hostility that would eventually erupt into civil war. Well, first of all, it established the principle of nullification that states could nullify federal laws that they considered unconstitutional. Although this would be a controversial and ultimately losing issue for the Confederacy in the Civil War, nullification was an important part of the antebellum Southern ideology. Secondly, it showed how fragile the Union was in its early years. In less than a decade, the country had come close to breaking apart twice. Once over the issue of slavery in Missouri, and again over the issue of tariffs. This revealed just how divided the nation was along sectional lines, and how little loyalty people felt to the nation as a whole. And finally, it established the legacy of disloyalty that Southerners would carry with them into the Civil War. Once the Northerners accused the Southerners of disloyalty in causing this crisis, that label stuck and never really went away. Southerners were always viewed with suspicion by the North, especially after this. South Carolina accepts this compromise and nullifies their ordinance of nullification. Secession is averted and everybody goes home happy. Well, not really. So you can imagine that the South wasn't exactly jumping for joy when the Tariff of 1828 was passed, which raised the rates on most items by about 25%. First of all, the actual language of the tariff left the door open for future nullification. Remember that Clay had based his compromise on the assumption that the South would accept the gradual reduction of the tariff rates. But he never did fully address the underlying issue of whether or not the South could nullify tariffs in the first place. And fourth, while the immediate crisis was averted, sectional tensions continued to mount. Southerners came to view the federal government with suspicion, believing that it was being run by Northern industrialists and financiers who were using tariffs to benefit themselves at the expense of the agricultural South. And that belief in the inherent immorality of the federal government would eventually result in the Confederacy taking the drastic step of seceding from the Union. That is, if the South didn't like any future tariffs, they could just say, well, we nullified this one, and we'll nullify any other one we don't like. Secondly, although South Carolina backed down, other states didn't. For example, in 1834, the state of Virginia passed a nullification statute declaring that if the federal government ever imposed any kind of internal taxes or duties on the people of Virginia, then that law would be null and void within the state. And after that, a number of states held conventions to discuss nullification and secession, including North Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and Louisiana. And although none of these states followed through with secession, it was clear that the country was still divided over the issue. They called this the Tariff of Abominations, and while the North liked it, the South hated it. And second, we need to remember that the election of 1828 resulted in the victory of Andrew Jackson, a man considered to be a representative of the common man and the champion of nullification. That is the theory that states could nullify federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. Okay, so in order to understand this thing, we need to remember a few things from our last video. Now remember that the issue of tariffs had been a point of contention between the North and the South since the very beginning. Now the South's opposition to the tariff was based not only on the issue of states' rights. That is the idea that states had the right to nullify federal laws they didn't like, but also on the basis that the tariff was unconstitutional. South Carolina led the charge against the tariff and declared it null and void within their borders, and even threatened to secede from the Union if the federal government tried to collect the tariff from them. Now, as I said in the last video, Jackson was a proponent of nullification, and he made it clear that he opposed the force bill, which would have allowed him to use military force to collect the tariff from South Carolina. However, he also made it clear that he thought the South Carolina Ordinance of Nullification was unconstitutional. So, okay, where are we? The South hates the tariff, especially South Carolina. And Jackson, who is a pro-nullification guy, is president. And today, we're looking at the period known as the Walker and Polk era. And no, force was to settle the Oregon boundary dispute with Britain, and in fact, they are. But since they all happened during this time period, I figured I should mention them here. Polk campaigned on the slogan 5-4-40, or 5. They believed that high tariffs were not only economically burdensome, but also served to enrich favored groups at the expense of consumers. Now, this territorial disagreement centered around the northwestern region of the United States and British Canada. The primary point of contention was the exact location of the border along the Columbia River, with Americans advocating for a border at the southern tip of the Vancouver Island, while the British claimed the border should be along the 49th parallel. Tensions escalated during the 1840s, leading to a surge in American settlers moving to the Oregon Territory, many of whom were eager to fight a potential war with Britain over the issue. This movement, sometimes referred to as the Oregon Fever, exemplified the spirit of manifest destiny, a widely held belief in the United States during this period that American settlers were destined to expand across the continent. In 1846, under Polk's presidency, the Oregon Treaty was signed. This agreement resolved the dispute by establishing the 49th parallel as the border between British Canada and the United States, although this fell short of the 54-40 or fight. Rhetoric used in the lead-up to the war, it was still seen as a victory for the United States. It solidified American control over the Oregon Territory and removed a potential source of conflict with Britain. This belief was particularly strong among southern and western states who felt that the existing tariffs, disproportionately, benefited the industrial interests of the Northeast. Go ahead and put your answer into the comment section. Then, after you do that, I'll reveal the answer and we'll move on. The Walker Tariff, officially the Tariff Act of 1846, was championed by President James K. Polk. You see the Walker Tariff reduced tariffs on imported goods, which lowered prices for consumers all over the country. But how could this be considered a success, considering that tariffs are supposed to protect domestic industries from foreign competition? And his Treasury Secretary, Robert Walker, a close friend of Polk's and a representative from Mississippi. It drastically reduced tariffs, slashing the average rates from around 32% to 25%. This reduction was substantial, marking one of the most significant decreases in American tariff history up to that point. The rationale behind this reduction was rooted in the democratic ideal of free trade, an economic system that promotes minimal government intervention in commercial activity and the free flow of goods across international borders. The Walker Tariff reflected this ideology by significantly decreasing barriers to trade, thereby promoting the exchange of goods, both domestically and internationally. This shift towards free trade had a profound impact on the U.S. economy, boosting trade and consequently increasing imports. The Walker Tariff thus symbolized a transition in U.S. economic policy, marking the beginning of the free trade phase in U.S. tariff policy. That, continued to influence economic policy throughout much of the 19th century, referring to the northern border that American expansionists wanted to establish with British Canada. While this particular aspect of the dispute didn't go America's way, the larger issue of manifest destiny continued to drive westward expansion. Polk's administration also saw the start of the Mexican-American War in 1846. This conflict, which lasted until 1848, resulted in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This treaty forced Mexico to cede more than half of its territory, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. This vast acquisition of land nearly doubled the size of the United States and provided a significant boost to the concept of manifest destiny. The addition of these territories also diversified the nation's geography, introducing new climates, resources, and cultures into the American landscape. All four of these things would have a profound impact on the United States and set the stage for its future expansion and development. This was a long-standing democratic ideal, but had recently gained traction due to the Second Bank of the United States. Involvement in the financial panic of 1837. Under Polk's leadership, Congress passed the Independent Treasury Act of 1846, which established a system of treasury notes backed by gold and silver held in independent vaults separate from commercial banks. This was significant because it removed government funds from private financial institutions, making the government itself the sole guardian of its own money. Proponents like Polk argued that this would ensure the safety and integrity of public funds, reduce the influence of private banks on government fiscal policy, and curb the frequency of financial panics. However, critics saw it as an attack on the banking industry and feared that it would limit the availability of credit and hurt economic growth. Okay, so this period in American history lasted for only one term, from 1846 to 1849. That was during which time the country experienced tremendous growth and change. Much of this can be attributed to the efforts of the 11th President, James K. Polk. He took office with a bold agenda of accomplishing four major goals. And despite being in office for only 4 years, he accomplished all of them. So what were these goals? Well, no. 1 was to re-establish the independent treasury. No. 2 was to acquire California. No. 3 was to lower tariffs. Now, each one of those goals could probably be their own video. Let's start with the independent treasury. Next, there was the acquisition of California. This was a major point of contention during the presidential campaign of 1844. The third goal was lowering tariffs. Now, this was a key element of the Democratic Party's political platform. But in this video, we are looking at the causes of the Civil War, and in this particular video, we're focusing on the Morrill Tariff. In fact, before the Civil War, Southerners had argued against protective tariffs. But after the war began, they seemed to have no problem with them whatsoever. Well, it protected all sorts of northern industries, including railroads, ironworks, woolen goods, cotton mills, breweries, flour, milling, whiskey distillation, watches, clocks, carpets, hats, shoes, paper, glass, earthenware, furniture, sugar refineries, and tobacco factories, just to name a. The list goes on. You can see that the Morrill Tariff of 1861 essentially protected manufacturing industries in the North. It did this by making it more expensive for consumers to buy manufactured goods coming from Europe. First and foremost, the Morrill Tariff permanently established the Republican Party's economic program of protectionism as the policy of the federal government. With cheap labor gone and an economy geared toward agriculture, which was always a risky business, the South remained poor long after the Civil War ended. Then, when they needed to buy manufactured goods, they had to purchase them from the industrialized North. Thus, the economic chasm between the two regions only widened during the late 19th century and continued well into the 20th century. First of all, many people today still argue over the role of tariffs in protecting American industry. All right, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 4. And I appreciate you watching, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimer out. Remember, the ultimate goal of the Morrill Tariff was to protect American industry. Whether or not tariffs should play a significant role in American life is still debated today. Secondly, many argue that the economic policies enacted following the Civil War played a significant role in the poverty of the modern American South. Many argue that the North used its economic power to keep the South weak in order to maintain its own dominance. Lastly, the relationship between big business and government, which grew out of the Morrill Tariff and its subsequent protective policies, is still prevalent today. Some argue that big businesses use government tariffs and subsidies to limit competition and grow ever larger. Others argue that big businesses need this support in order to compete with foreign businesses. While the North, with abundant raw materials and a ready-made consumer market in the South, boomed economically. When Northern manufacturers could count on steady and substantial profits due to high tariffs, they invested their money into factories, machinery, and expansion. Furthermore, when these Northern manufacturers found themselves in direct competition with European manufacturers, they often chose to consolidate in order to build larger and more efficient plants that could compete on an international scale. So it's not too much of a stretch to say that the Morrill Tariff contributed to the growth of big business in America. And as the South grew increasingly poorer, it became more dependent upon the North. This created a situation where the North could dictate terms to the South in order to ensure that it continued to buy Northern goods. In fact, it would not be until the 1920s that protectionist policies would begin to fall out of favor. As a result, Americans were more likely to buy domestically produced goods. Therefore, Northern manufacturers could sell more products at a higher price. The Republicans saw this as a golden opportunity to reshape the nation's economy to their own liking. For example, beginning in 1862, Congress passed legislation providing internal improvements. Remember that these were dominated by Western Democrats. This encouraged settlement in the Western territories and helped to open up the Great Plains for agriculture. Now, while historians debate how effective the Homestead Act really was in accomplishing these goals, that's a topic for another video. Suffice it to say here that it did open up the West somewhat. And that's going to be important in shaping the relationship between the post-civil, or industrial North, and the agrarian South. So this made the party slightly more palatable for Northern manufacturers. These subsidies paid for the construction of new roads, canals, railroads, and other infrastructure that supported transportation of manufactured goods throughout the nation. This was extremely important for expanding markets for manufactured goods. And so they went to work building up industry in the North and cementing the South's dependence on the industrialized North. Okay, so by the mid-1800s, the Republican Party had firmly established itself as the party of high tariffs and industry, and therefore economic protectionism. Conversely, the Democratic Party championed free trade and states' rights. However, after the Southern states seceded from the Union in 1860 and 1861, the Republican Congress found itself with no Southern opposition and thus was able to pass protective legislation with little or no resistance. The first such law was the Morrill Tariff of 1861. Now the Morrill Tariff raised the average tariff rate to nearly 40%, which is very, very high, especially for that time period. This was done under the guise of funding the Union war effort. And though the tariff did raise revenue, that wasn't its primary purpose. Rather, the main purpose of the Morrill Tariff was to protect Northern industries from foreign competition. This was accomplished by raising tariffs on manufactured goods coming from abroad, and thereby it protected Northern businesses who produced those same items. Furthermore, because the Confederacy was largely agrarian, exporting very few manufactured goods, this meant that the South would not be significantly affected by these high tariffs. In fact, Southerners would probably benefit somewhat because they could buy cheaper manufactured goods that were now being produced in the North. That's right. Even though the South was being economically hurt by the high tariffs imposed by the Morrill Tariff, Southerners would actually benefit from that because they didn't produce those things anyway. And the British, who were dependent upon American cotton, were more than willing to pay higher prices for that cotton. This further added to the economic advantage enjoyed by the Southern states. And so you can probably see why the South wouldn't mind the imposition of these protective tariffs. So what exactly did the Morrill Tariff protect? Not only did the Morrill Tariff protect industries, it also subsidized some of them. Furthermore, in 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act, which granted 160 acres of public lands to any person who would cultivate it for 5 years. As you might imagine, the combination of high tariffs, subsidies, and public lands shaped the American economy in lasting ways. Second, the combination of these economic policies and the end of slavery led to an incredible disparity in wealth between the industrialized North and the agricultural South. For example, after Reconstruction ended in 1877, Southerners were forced into sharecropping and tenancy arrangements which kept them working the land as a cheap form of labor. Lastly, the Morrill Tariff and subsequent protective tariffs contributed greatly to the rise of big business in the United States. So why does any of this matter today? Well, the legacy of the Morrill Tariff lives on in many ways. Whatever the case may be, the legacy of the Morrill Tariff continues to shape the American economy and political landscape even today. And in it, we go into look at how big business and big government intertwined in the late 19th century to form what we might call crony capitalism. The United States has had a series of wars with Mexico over this region, but now it's all settled and we have a huge new territory to manage. The first thing to know is that in the years following the Civil War, tariffs stayed high even though the war was over, and the Union no longer needed to manufacture guns and ammo. And that was good news for the wealthy industrialists, who had gotten rich manufacturing military supplies during the war. Those folks didn't want their hard-earned wealth to go away, so they lobbied Congress to keep the tariffs high. And since Congress loved money and didn't really care all that much about the common people, they agreed. It's absolutely free, and it helps me get this stuff out to more people. Now this last one was called the McKinley Tariff, and it raised prices to outrageous levels. So much for lowering tariffs, right? Well, the McKinley Tariff was the result of decades of incremental increases in the level of tariffs, and it reflected the fact that many business leaders wanted to ensure their dominance in the face of foreign competition. And that meant that tariffs were at their lowest point since 1860. However, that is as far as I'm willing to say that this era was coming to an end. As the federal government grew in size and power, it increasingly worked to protect and advance the interests of industrialists. Despite the seemingly endless debate over the proper level of tariffs, two things were certain. Tariffs would remain high, and they would be manipulated for the benefit of a few well-connected industrialists. In other words, crony capitalism. And that created what Thomas DeLorenzo calls crony capitalism. Crony capitalism is an economic system in which politicians favor certain businesses with regard to taxation and tributiation, with the effect of creating monopolies and oligopolies that stifle competition and exploit consumers. Because if you look beyond this superficial reduction in tariffs, you can see that things weren't changing all that much. Also, I want to let you know about a site which offers full-length, high-quality practice tests for all sorts of standardized tests. Yet even this slight reduction was undone by a loophole called the Dingley Act. Under this loophole, certain raw materials escaped import duties altogether. And although this measure ostensibly lowered costs for manufacturers, it actually had the effect of raising prices, because it allowed industrialists to claim that their products were cheaper than they really were. I've been using it myself to brush up on my test-taking skills, and it's been really helpful. Instead, the Republicans nominated a former president, Teddy Roosevelt, partly because he was popular with the masses and partly because he supported lower tariffs. So although the McKinley Tariff was passed, it was clear that the era of high tariffs was coming to an end. And one of the chief among those opportunities was the opportunity to build industries. And that was also due to the high tariffs. So you can see how the folks who benefited from the tariffs wanted to keep them in place, or the Tariff of 1883. Now, the idea behind this new law was to lower tariffs to more reasonable levels, and it seemed like it would help the average American consumer. However, by the time the measure reached the president's desk, it was so watered down by competing special interests that it ended up protecting certain industries from foreign competition while raising prices on others. So, great job, Congress. Way to fix a problem. But there was a problem, and that was that the American public did not like paying high tariffs on everyday goods. But there were also some increases that protected certain manufacturers from foreign competition. And those manufacturers were very pleased. So the end result was that this new Tariff Act, which was supposed to be a reform, ended up being a confusing mix of price increases and reductions that benefited no one and enraged everyone. More and more, it seemed that tariff policy was being determined not by elected representatives of the people, but by a handful of well-connected industrialists. And that spelled trouble for the future of the nation. That hurt them directly, and it made them resent the wealthy industrialists who were getting rich off of it. So there was growing pressure on Congress to do something about the tariffs. So if you're ready to get those brain cells melted, let's get to it. First, as the U.S. expanded, it incorporated many of the principles of industrial capitalism into its political structure. That is, it was very laissez-faire and pro-business. Second, the war itself spurred industrial growth because during the Civil War, industrialists figured out ways to make more and better weapons. And that meant that those businesses got rich. And then they could use that wealth to expand. Third, tariffs, or taxes on imported goods, remained high after the war ended. And that protected American industries from foreign competition. So if you've been watching these videos in order, then you'll remember that in our last video, we left off right about here. A tariff is a tax levied on an imported good, like a car you drive in from Canada. It's a tax on that car. Or say some steel beams you bring into the United States from China. They too will be taxed. The purpose of tariffs is twofold. First, they protect domestic industry from foreign competition. And second, they raise money for the federal government. But wait, why would there be an opportunity to build industries in this new Western territory? Well, there are several reasons. And speaking of tariffs, let us go ahead and define that term right now so that we're all on the same page. Okay, so with all that background in mind, let's see how it played out in the real world. Now, the federal government actually ran budget surpluses during this period, meaning that it took in more money than it spent. Well, by 1883, things came to a head and Congress passed what was called the Molten Tariff. Now, don't get me wrong, there were some reductions in the new tariff schedule, and those pleased consumers. And before we move on, if you're enjoying this content, please subscribe. Okay, so this era of post-war protectionism lasted until 1890, when a new tariff act proved to be the last straw. However, the outcry against high prices led by farmers and consumers forced Congress to create the Wilson-Gorman Tariff in 1894, which lowered rates slightly. By the time the McKinley Tariff was passed in 1890, public outrage over high prices and the influence of special interests was so great that even President Benjamin Harrison, who was a Republican and generally favored high tariffs, did not run for re-election. And the reason I say that the era was coming to an end is because in 1894, the Wilson-Gorman Tariff reduced rates even further. The reality was that by the end of the 19th century, big business and big government were inextricably intertwined. And nowhere was this more evident than in the field of tariffs. Okay. Well, hey there, and welcome back to my channel. Now, if you've been following along with my AP government curriculum, then you're probably looking for that big, juicy vocab word in this document. Well, look no further than the very first sentence of this excerpt. From the McKinley Tariff of 1890. Following the Civil War, Congress passed a series of protective tariffs to help American industry grow and feel safe from foreign competition. You see, high tariffs meant that raw materials were more expensive, which drove up the cost of production, which ultimately fell on the consumer. So urban workers who had to buy these manufactured goods now had to pay more for them. But overall, the McKinley Tariff was protective. Duties on 4,000 items were increased, and only 500 items got cheaper. So in general, it was very unpopular with consumers. Here's a cartoon depicting that. On the left, we have a farmer paying high prices for a shirt, while on the right, we have a factory owner paying high prices for sugar. But you'll notice that the farmer is darker in complexion, which was a common way of depicting African Americans during this period. McKinley tried to make amends by signing the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act, which outlawed monopolies, but it wasn't enough. Voters went out in the 1890 midterm elections and gave Democrats control of the House of Representatives. So that's another irony. The McKinley Tariff, which was supposed to help McKinley win the election, instead caused him to lose. Protectionism, it turns out, was not a popular idea among the American people. Why did they want to do that? Well, during the war, the North had basically been blockaded from trading with the South. You see, the United States did not enact this protective tariff in a vacuum. Other countries had tariffs too, and they protected their own industries from foreign competition. In response, the McKinley Tariff included a provision that lowered tariffs for nations that lowered their tariffs for the United States. In other words, if you lower my tariffs, I'll lower mine for you. That's what they call a negotiating tactic, reciprocity. But this was a rather complex negotiation, because there were a lot of players. Let me show you this chart. It shows every major country in the world and whether or not they had a protective tariff, and if so, what their rate was. As you can see, almost every nation on Earth had some sort of tariff, although only a few were higher than the United States. Anyway, the point is that if the U.S. lowered their tariffs for just one of these countries, then that country would likely lower theirs for the U.S. as well. That would make trade more free, which was consistent with the Republican belief in free markets. However, if the U.S. lowered their tariffs for multiple countries, then they might wind up in a situation where they had significantly lower tariffs than the rest of the world. So that was risky. And that, SYULL, notice that the United States only enacted reciprocity with a handful of countries. They lowered their tariffs for Canada, Cuba, Chile, and a couple others, but they certainly didn't lower them for Germany or France or Great Britain. Well, obviously, it would be the countries that already had fairly low tariffs. In this list, which of these countries already had low tariffs? Well, according to this chart, Canada and Chile both had relatively low tariffs compared to the rest of the world. So if we go back to our list, we can see that the United States enacted reciprocity with Chile and Canada. That makes sense, doesn't it? We're going to make a deal with people who are willing to make a deal with us. And by the time the war was over, northern industries were much stronger. But now they faced stiff competition from European manufacturers. To combat this, Congress passed the Morrill Tariff in 1861, and then the Wilson-Gorman Tariff in 1872. Then in 1890, this guy, William McKinley, became president. He campaigned on the promise of lowering tariffs, and during his campaign, he even described himself as a free trader. But once he got into office, special interest groups like the American Sugar Refining Company threatened to withdraw their support for him unless he raised tariffs on sugar. Oh, and by the way, these guys spent about $1 million lobbying him, which in today's money would be about $29 million. So McKinley listened and he proposed a new tariff which would raise rates to 49.5%, which was more than double the average tariff rate at the time. It was also the highest peacetime rate ever. Now you might be saying to yourself, wait a minute, didn't the United States just fight a war to end slavery? Yeah, well, don't get too excited. This wasn't exactly a Jeffersonian ideal of government. For most of America's history up until this point, tariffs had always been used to raise revenue for the government. But now Republicans began to justify tariffs as a way of protecting American industry. And McKinley was especially zealous in doing so. He argued that a protective tariff was necessary to safeguard national security. PROMOTE, national prosperity and advance national honor. Whoa, that sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Like, where have I heard that before? Anyway, the McKinley Tariff passed easily in the Republican-controlled Senate, but ran into trouble in the House where Democrats pointed out that it violated the Republican platform and therefore made them liars. Also, they argued that it was an egregious example of the Republican policy of protectionism, and therefore they should vote against it. Democrats were joined by a couple of Republicans who shared their concerns about protectionism, and together they defeated the McKinley Tariff. And that right there is your big juicy irony. A protective tariff championed by a Republican president failed because Republicans were being called on their hypocrisy. So that's some real irony. Let me read it to you so we can identify that vocab word together. The free and unrestricted flow of imports into the United States is hereby declared to be the policy of the United States, and the benefits of such imports shall be extended to all foreign nations without discrimination. Aha, do you see it? What does this mean when they say free and unrestricted flow? That means there are no restrictions on trade or commerce coming into the United States. So what's the opposite of that? Protectionism. This tariff was an extremely protective one, raising duties to 49.5%, the highest peacetime rates ever. But wait, don't go just yet. Before you leave me a comment about how I promised you a vocab word, and all I did was explain the concept. Let me finish explaining this document because there's a lot more here than just that. Okay, so before we dive into the details of this massive tariff, let's first consider the historical context. But it gets better. See? William McKinley was running for re-election in 1892, and he desperately needed the support of urban workers who suffered greatly under this protective tariff. So after the 1890 election, what happened next? Well, that brings us to another significant feature of the McKinley Tariff, and that was its inclusion of reciprocity. Anyway, the reciprocity provisions in the McKinley Tariff led to the creation of the Dingley. Reciprocity and the U.S. actually lowered tariffs for these countries. In the 1860s, Americans began arguing about tariffs in a way that we're familiar with today. Republicans wanted higher tariffs to protect industry, while Democrats wanted lower tariffs to keep down the cost of living. But this wasn't the first time Americans had argued over tariffs. In fact, it was the third such debate in American history. After all, cheaper manufactured goods meant your clothes and tools and furniture would all cost less. But this wasn't the whole story. You see, the Democratic view on tariffs was basically the same as our modern Republican view on taxes, which is to say, if you make more money, you'll spend more money. That's because southern states relied on exporting crops like cotton to Europe. And tariffs made it more expensive for Europeans to buy American cotton. Republicans were split between those who wanted higher tariffs to protect industry and those who didn't care much about tariffs either way. That's because tariffs had become fused with other issues that Americans cared about. Specifically, sectionalism, class conflict, and industrial capitalism. Sectionalism was the belief that the interests of different regions were so fundamentally opposed that it was impossible to compromise. If you favored high tariffs, you were a Republican. We know they raise prices, reduce trade, and often end up hurting consumers. If you elect a Republican, you'll have a tariff on every shirt collar and a Republican on every egg that you eat. Brian was saying that Republicans would tax you so much that you wouldn't be able to afford food or clothing. That's how personal tariffs had become. But the reality is more complicated than that. The Republican Party was once anti-slavery, and the Democratic Party was once pro-slavery. The Republican Party was once isolationist, and the Democratic Party was once interventionist. And the Republican Party was once pro-tariff, and the Democratic Party was once anti-tariff. But until the early 1900s, tariffs were hugely popular with Americans, even though they knew they paid higher prices. Republicans became known as the pro-business party, and Democrats became known as the pro-labor party. And so when we think about tariffs today, we think of Republicans wanting to protect American jobs and Democrats wanting to lower the cost of living. Today, Democrats are mostly anti-tariff and Republicans are mostly pro-tariff. But if you want to understand how we got here, you need to understand the long history of tariffs and how the meaning of tariffs changed over time. But that hasn't always been the case. Not in the 1820s, not in the 1860s, and not even in the 1920s. The reason is simple. Tariffs had become a way for Americans to define themselves politically. We love tariffs because they tell us who we are. If you favored low tariffs, you were a Democrat. That's why during the Gilded Age, tariffs became the central feature of American politics. They were a sort of Rorschach test for American identity. The industrial interests of the North were completely at odds with the agricultural interests of the South, so neither side could trust the other to represent their interest. That's why tariffs became a proxy for everything else, because neither side could trust the other to fairly represent their interests. Not on tariffs, and certainly not on anything else. Most Southern Democrats wanted low tariffs to protect Southern agriculture, while most Northern Democrats were open to some tariffs to protect Northern industry. This made finding common ground even more difficult. But these debates reveal an important shift in how Americans thought about tariffs. For that reason, Southerners tended to oppose tariffs, which soured relations with the manufacturing interests in the North. Southerners claimed that they were being taxed to pay for the Northern states' factories. So you can probably guess how surprised Southerners were when the Civil War ended and the federal government started spending tons of money helping Northern factories rebuild. So lower tariffs, like lower taxes, would mean more spending on manufactured goods. So Democrats weren't just trying to help ordinary people. They also wanted to stimulate the economy. And each time the debates over tariffs revealed not only economic disagreement, but also changes in how Americans thought about politics and what they considered important for their identity. On one side were factory owners who were generally wealthy, white, and male. And on the other side were workers who were mostly poor and immigrant. As a result, tariffs could now be framed as a tool to help the working class, because protecting American industry from foreign competition would protect American jobs. Or tariffs could be framed as a tool to help the wealthy, because tariffs imposed taxes on imported goods, which made domestically produced goods more competitive, which meant factory owners got richer. So here's the surprising history of tariffs. Before the Civil War, Americans disagreed over tariffs and who they should benefit. But those disagreements didn't match up neatly to the lines we're used to today. Back then, Americans generally favored tariffs, but argued over how high they should be and who would benefit from them. That's why tariff debates were always complicated. That's because tariffs seemed to help certain industries grow, which in turn helped certain factory owners get rich, which was fine because Whigs believed in a limited role for government. They didn't want the government to try to manage the economy, so they certainly weren't going to try to pick winners and losers. Instead, Whigs preferred to set up a system of rules that everyone had to follow. Tariffs were just one such rule. By protecting American industry from foreign competition, tariffs allowed businesses to grow without government interference. The idea was that once a business could stand on its own, it would be able to compete globally without any tariffs at all. But there were two basic positions. The first wanted lower tariffs to help consumers by lowering the price of manufactured goods and making life cheaper overall. The second wanted higher tariffs to protect manufacturers from foreign competition so that American factories could grow. The first position was associated with the Democratic Party, or at least a group within the Democratic Party, because it seemed to help ordinary people. The second position on tariffs was associated with the Whig Party. But tariffs weren't popular with everyone, especially not in the South. By the 1870s, tariffs were as divisive as ever, but now along new lines. While before tariffs had been an economic issue, by the late 1800s, tariffs had become a political issue. This fusion of tariffs with other issues was made even more complicated by the rise of industrial capitalism. That's because industrial capitalism pitted workers against owners, so tariffs became symbolic. They became a way to define who you were. Today, both parties are pretty much in agreement that tariffs aren't great. In 1896, William Jennings Bryan, who ran as a Democrat, gave a famous speech about tariffs in which he said, "Even after the popularity of tariffs waned in the early 1900s, the symbolism remained. What's America's favorite pastime? Baseball, apple pie, jazz, or maybe it's watching the federal government squabble over how to screw everybody else over. It's this last one that brings us together today." In order to pay for all of the people who died and the land that was destroyed during the conflict, the United States now owes a hell of a lot of money. As such, Congress passes the first of 3 acts that would shape American fiscal policy until the dawn of the 20th century. Steel, for example, was in high demand. The first modern American tariff was the Tariff of 1828, nicknamed the Protectionist Bill or the Great Tariff by supporters and detractors, respectively. Would the U.S. continue to industrialize? Would tariffs prove to be an effective means of generating revenue? They can also affect diplomacy. For decades, tariffs were mostly an internal affair, having little bearing on the U.S.'s international standing. Working-class Americans hated tariffs because they drove up the price of everyday goods. Factory owners loved tariffs because they shut out foreign competition. But Congress overrode his veto, and the act became law. Republicans favored higher tariffs for the sake of protecting industry and creating jobs. Democrats opposed tariffs and preferred lower prices for consumers. Neither party wanted to give an inch. Now, we're not going to talk about Roosevelt's tenure in depth, because that's a whole other video. But it's worth mentioning that he broke with the Republican Party's pro-tariff stance. Instead, he trimmed the fat off the McKinley Tariff, lowering rates from 48% to 40% in what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary. So once again, the issue was kicked upstairs to the people. Next time you hear someone spouting fiscal talking points, you'll know whether they're a Grover Cleveland Democrat or a William Jennings Bryan populist, or maybe you'll discover a new Republican. After all, history tends to repeat itself. And if the last 150 years have taught us anything, it's that nothing changes and everything is the same. Thanks for watching. Remember, in 1900, the U.S. was still figuring out what its identity was. Was it a libertarian paradise? Was it an industrial dynamo? Was it a farming collective? The answer, by the way, is none of the above. But that's beside the point. The stalemate over tariffs was indicative of a larger divide within the electorate. The election of 1900 would become known as the first modern presidential election, marking a shift from local issues to national ones. William McKinley, the Republican candidate, ran on a platform of fiscal conservatism, focusing largely on the gold standard. His Democratic challenger, William Jennings Bryan, ran on free silver, trying to expand the money supply to boost the falling price of agricultural commodities. Sound familiar? It should. These are modern talking points. One party wants less government involvement in the economy, while the other wants to use the government to regulate it. And both sides use tariffs as a wedge issue to win over voters. In doing so, they set the stage for one final act of tariff madness. At this point, you've probably noticed a trend in American fiscal policy. Raise tariffs, realize they suck, make them slightly less terrible, repeat. The McKinley Tariff of 1897 followed this pattern to a T. Rates were raised on an average of 40% to an average of 48%. The act also consolidated power in Washington at the expense of customs houses, eliminating hundreds of thousands of jobs in the process. Farmers liked tariffs because they could make exporting easier, But they hated tariffs because they made importing parts and materials more expensive. So basically everyone agreed the U.S. needed to come up with a better way to generate revenue. But as the U.S. began flexing its industrial muscle, other countries started to notice. In 1894, Congress passed the Wilson-Gorman-Hall Act, which slapped tariffs on more than 4,000 items, raised rates on more than 1,500 of them, and lowered rates on 500 others. On paper, it seemed like a great compromise. In reality, it was a mess. The act was so complex that no one could figure out what the actual tariff rate was for any given item, leaving importers confused and angry and the entire system ripe for corruption. There were exceptions for certain raw materials and luxuries, but those were just loopholes that the wealthy used to avoid tariffs altogether. By the late 19th century, American tariffs averaged around 40%. It's far higher than any other developed nation. This protectionist policy eventually forced other countries to follow suit. Suddenly, the U.S. was facing retaliation from powerful trading partners. This made trade more expensive and led to instability. Europe, for example, began to look elsewhere for markets, opening up lucrative opportunities in Asia. Meanwhile, American manufacturers got comfortable with selling domestically, making them less competitive on the global stage. It was a lose-lose scenario. Or would the whole thing collapse and force the U.S. into a depression? It wasn't until the early 1900s that it became clear which path the U.S. was taking. By 1900, the U.S. was an industrial superpower, with world-leading companies in steel, automobiles, and oil. The number of patents issued in the U.S. quadrupled. Between 1870 and 1900, foreign factories were practically being outpaced by American ones. Even agriculture benefited from tariffs, albeit unintentionally. When European agricultural prices spiked due to a devastating blight on potatoes, American farmers were able to export their crops for a tidy profit. So tariffs were clearly working. Like most things in American politics, the party affiliations are flipped nowadays. But back in the day, Democrats favored tariffs because they helped Northern industrialists, while Republicans, who tended to be Southerners, thought tariffs unfairly advantaged the North at the expense of the South. The South didn't want to pay higher prices for manufactured goods, nor did they want to compete with industrial workers who could be paid less than the enslaved people they owned. If you're thinking this sounds eerily similar to today's Republican talking points, congratulations, you're right. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Unfortunately, the U.S. didn't have much steel infrastructure yet, meaning the price of imported steel was cheaper than anything domestic producers could manufacture. With a protective tariff, American steel would become more competitive and the market share would eventually shift to favor domestic producers. Of course, the drawback of tariffs is that you pay them every time you buy something imported, so the price of everything goes up. This is good for factory owners, but bad for consumers, especially poor consumers who can't afford to pay more for the things they need. As economist Paul Krugman said, tariffs are a tax that makes foreigners rich and it falls most heavily on the poor. Also, they're kind of a dick move. The Revenue Act of 1866, aka the first income tax ever, slaps a 3% tax on all incomes above $800. That's about $7,000 in today's money. The tax only lasts 3 years though, which means everyone gets to enjoy their newfound wealth from the HHE. You know, we've said WH.Wall stay. Slaps a 3% color. Slaps a 3% tax on wall. My HHF, my S, my HHF, my wah, dot sell wah, my HA. Wah, my wah, I. Play lies, by I lie, it a wah, kade. Kawaii with a sabrik at sick kawaii to me at a leak, it unsalad it, sick it, bait it, I did it, it, like, that's the occupy to plitz it, it's benefits, that's Confederacy briefly before Congress decides to extend the tax into perpetuity in 1867 with the Second Act. The income tax is increased to 5% with additional rates levied on incomes over $10,000. Welcome to my channel. It's me. And today, we are going to talk about taxes, baby. More specifically, we're gonna talk about the complicated legacy of 19th century tariff acts that make up our tax code today. What is a tariff? Why should you care about something that happened before you were born? And why does it matter that your great-grandfather was a literal child when this stuff was happening? Trust me, by the end of this video, you will be well-informed enough to fake your way through several conversations about fiscal policy. The year is 1866. The Civil War has just ended, and America finds itself in a peculiar situation. Why are we talking about taxes? Because, like most things that affect literally every single American alive or dead, it all boils down to tariffs. To understand tariffs, we must first understand the word tariff. A tariff is a tax on imports, meaning the price you pay to another country for the privilege of bringing their goods into yours. Now, there are many reasons countries choose to do this: protecting domestic industry, punishing foreign nations for being mean, or in America's case, funding the federal government while simultaneously sticking it to people who don't vote. In this case, tariffs didn't go directly to the federal government. They went to the customs houses run by local politicians whose districts depended on the ports for economic activity. Meaning, if you wanted to import British textiles, you would have to pay a tariff to the local politician, who would then take a cut and pass the rest along to the feds. This system allowed for some flexibility based on regional interest, but also created a lot of opportunity for corruption. Smuggling became so widespread that the Treasury Department created a whole new branch to combat it: the Coast Guard. Not only did these tariffs help fund the federal government, but they were a way for Congress to protect nascent industries from foreign competition. In 1866, the U.S. was on the cusp of becoming an industrial powerhouse, thanks in part to a series of inventions that took raw materials and turned them into finished products. This Revenue Act was not the first time the U.S. had levied tariffs on imported goods. Back in 1866, no one really knew what the future would hold. But as we mentioned before, tariffs affect more than just the balance sheets of major corporations and the food prices for the working class. As the century wore on, public opinion turned against tariffs, but not in the way you might expect. With the spoils of the Civil War fading fast, the next logical step was to hit everyone where it hurts: the pocketbook. Even the president hated this tariff act. Grover Cleveland vetoed the bill in 1894, calling it unfair and misbegotten of special privilege. All of this resulted in two major parties forming around tariffs, each with its own agenda. Who do you think won? We'll tell you right after. After William McKinley won the election of 1900, he was assassinated 6 months later. And his VP, Theodore Roosevelt, took office. So now you know why tariffs are important. Not only did they shape American fiscal policy, but they also laid the groundwork for modern political parties.